I have two announcements from Renegade University, which are totally urgent because they involve webinars that are coming up soon and that are very popular. First is an introduction to cryptocurrency taught by Vin Armani, and that'll begin April 19th. Get your tickets at renegadeuniversity.com. Also, beginning May 5th, I'll be teaching a two-part webinar on Plato's Republic, which is part of our Great Books series. So again, go to renegadeuniversity.com for the Plato's Republic course. We have an early bird special. Between now and April 12th, it's only 1 credit. After that, it'll be 2 credits. So again, go to renegadeuniversity.com to purchase either Introduction to Cryptocurrency or Plato's Republic with me. Click it, buy it, and I'll see you in class. This is the Unregistered podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. This is a show about ideas, people, and behaviors that are considered inappropriate, out of bounds, or beyond the pale. The things you're not supposed to talk about if you're a school teacher, a college professor, a businessman, a politician, a parent, a neighbor, or even a podcast host. These are the things you're not supposed to say or even think if you're a good liberal, a good conservative, or a good citizen. Each week, I'll interview a person who has something bad to say. They might be a journalist or a professor. They might be a porn star or a drug dealer. They might just be an ordinary person with an ordinary job who doesn't care about the rules of polite society. I'm not interested in breaking the rules just to be a troublemaker. I'm interested in people who break the rules of conventional thought and to expand the scope of what is possible to say in our society. I'm interested in people who make me think. My guest this week belongs to the rarest political species of all. He's a conservative. This is my interview with Daniel McCarthy. I am joined from Alexandria, Virginia, well known as a suburb of Washington, D.C., by my very favorite conservative commentator in all of the United States of America. This is Daniel McCarthy, who is making his return appearance. Daniel was on the show last year, and people loved it so much, including me, that I had to have him back on, and especially because of all the stuff that's happened in American politics since then. I've been dying to know, Daniel, although I've been reading your column in The Spectator, so I have a good sense. But I really want to just dig into politics right now. Last time we talked about the history of conservatism, and you're probably going to be teaching a course for us at Renegade University on that subject, and we can certainly get into that here. But today, I want to get into what's going on now and what this means to you and what it means for conservatism in its classical sense and in any other sense as well. So welcome to the show. Welcome back to the show, Daniel, and let's do it.
Thanks. It's always a blast.
Great. Okay. Now, Donald Trump, pro or con? No. Upper, give him the thumbs up or thumbs down. So I have been, and it's hard for me to admit this publicly for reasons that are probably going to be pretty clear to you, but especially given the worlds I live in and operate in, I have become an obsessive fan of Steve Bannon's War Room. Have you watched it?
I haven't, unfortunately.
You need to. I've been telling people it represents roughly half of American politics right now. It's the Trump movement. It's the intellectual hub of the MAGA movement. And they have an incredible amount of energy and passion and fire, and they are not going away. And it's also a wonderful window into the mind of Steve Bannon, who I consider to be, and I'd love to get your feelings on this, your opinion on him. I think he's just a brilliant political, I don't even know how you would categorize him. And he's sort of part activist, part intellectual, strategist. But have you been taken by him in terms of his just sort of his intellectual abilities and what he's brought to political discourse in the last several years?
Yeah, so I mean, Bannon covers some territory that thinkers I had been interested in before Bannon came on the scene also covered. So some of Bannon's ideas have parallels to paleoconservatism. Some of them, sort of populist or nationalist ideas of Pat Buchanan, but also some of the sort of broader economic ideas that you find represented by some of the students of James Burnham and others of that sort of old conservative ilk. So Bannon, I think, has, partly independently and partly perhaps from having access to these sources, has devised a very, sort of interesting and sort of dynamic and unpredictable worldview, which has, a tendency, a center of gravity that is, in the nationalist direction. So I think all that's wonderful. I think there is a certain parallel between Bannon and someone like Newt Gingrich, in that Bannon's much more interesting than Newt Gingrich is. But in the same way that Gingrich would have a sort of movement very swiftly from sort of one idea to another, and would be very taken with new technologies and new possibilities in politics, I think you see some of that in Bannon as well, both for good and for ill. So I'm not sure that every initiative Bannon has undertaken is going to be successful or has been successful, but that kind of creativity and dynamism in politics is much needed.
Now, I've been studying the Bannon ideology and the MAGA ideology. I mean, Trump represents it inconsistently, right? So you don't want to look to Trump as, if you're looking for coherence. But I do think what he calls nationalist populism is a coherent ideology as it is articulated by Bannon and people in other countries. But do you see it as such, and how would you describe it? I'm really trying to get at the anatomy of this beast that is very much a part of American politics and is not going away. And it's not going away globally either. I mean, seems to be a rising force in Europe, certainly, and elsewhere. And what do you think of it as a sort of a worldview altogether?
Well, I think it's coming together as something that's more coherent. It has a lot of internal factions and a lot of sort of different internal emphases. We're seeing that right now with respect to various conservative ideas about sort of family subsidies and payments to families that have children and so forth, which not everyone, perhaps on the nationalist side, is in favor of. I have some subsidiarist reservations about that. I think that it's important that you have a nation state that's able to defend your economy against predatory practices by communist China, for example, or even against certain just facts of nature regarding wage differentials and things like that. But to have the central government take charge of family finances and of being the sort of breadwinner for family units, that I think is quite problematic. So there are these differences among nationalists and populists, but overall there is a general coherence there, which is partly driven by the entropy that we see overtaking liberalism, and that both left liberalism, and to a certain extent even the kind of liberalism of the center that you find with a certain kind of conservatism and with a certain kind of libertarianism, all of that is in a state of decay. It's having a very hard time maintaining a sense of legitimacy among the public. And even though this liberalism can be very good at providing for material needs, I think people have begun to feel kind of empty as a result of it. And they want something more than flat screen TVs. They want dignity. They want, sort of work that they feel is worth doing in terms of manufacturing and whatnot. And so these elements, these discontents with liberalism, do fit together into a pattern, certainly a critique. And how much of a positive program they fit into is something that we partly discovered with the Trump years, and I think we'll discover more of as time goes forward. And that's going to be, of course, the more challenging thing, is how do you actually operationalize these ideas and these sentiments into some sort of political program, into some sort of governing practice, as opposed to simply pulling apart the threads of the fraying fabric of liberalism.
So wait, you see liberalism as good at producing flat screen TVs?
Well, that seems to be how it measures its own success, right? Producing flat screen TVs, generally raising the level of sort of prosperity around the world, income levels, GDP. Liberals take those things very seriously.
Okay, so now who are we talking about? Are we talking about sort of the center leadership of the Democratic Party when we're talking about liberalism?
Well, I mean, a very broad kind of liberalism. So it would include the center leadership of the Democratic Party, certainly. I think it would also include your Mitt Romney Republicans, a lot of the Never Trump Republicans. And as I say, certainly the more technocratic kind of libertarian who's very happy with the way in which the world is developing right now. I think that person would also fit within that broad liberal spectrum.
Now, you are sounding a lot like Bannon. It's been so much fun to be immersed in this alternative way of thinking that it was completely alien to me. I think that's why I'm so excited by it, because, born and raised in Berkeley, radicals, yada, yada, then now whatever I am, I'm certainly not a conservative. But you hit on something right there that they talk about a lot, which I find fascinating, which is they call it materialism, the materialism of modern liberalism, which is that just what you're talking about, that they are concerned. Liberalism seems to be to them primarily concerned with what can be measured, weighed, held in one's hand, gawked at in a department store or at an Apple store, right? But that is, they're saying, not all of the human existence. There is much more in the world and in our minds, and maybe outside of our minds and outside of our bodies, that's a value that liberalism doesn't take into account of and certainly doesn't celebrate. In fact, they might even attack. Am I right? And so the spiritual realm, the realm outside of what the Enlightenment says is real and important to us.
I think that's right, except I would say that it's not that liberals don't believe these things exist, spiritual goods or kind of human personal goods, interpersonal relationships. But even these things, liberals will tend to convert or translate into market relationships. So when you think about the liberal attitude towards religion, it tends to be, well, it's great to have a panoply of religions and people can kind of pick and choose, which church to go to and so forth. And there certainly are advantages to that. But at the same time, what you lose when you have that level of religious freedom, for example, when you have free divorce, when you have all of these very liquid relationships, is any idea that you can have an option for strong commitments. And that's where a lot of the sort of hardline traditionalist criticisms of liberalism come from, for example, your integralist Catholics and your sort of other so-called illiberals of today. Now, nationalism and populism, it has some elements of that. And like I say, it buys into a lot of the critique of liberalism as too lacking in commitment, as too much dedicated towards an optimization of utility, right? Of just of pleasure and of, sort of crudely measuring what human happiness consists in. But nationalists and populists don't necessarily buy into some of the alternatives that are offered very coherently by, for example, the Catholic integralists, or perhaps various forms of Islam or other sorts of hardline religious traditionalists. That's one of, I think, the interesting theoretical challenges right now facing nationalism and populism. Again, it's one thing to have a critique of liberalism, but then it's harder to say how you're going to either reform liberalism or replace it with something that is, stronger in some ways, but you may also be losing, freedoms that people take for granted and that really are essential to their well-being and their happiness right now.
Okay, so are we talking about valuing the transcendent? Is that what's missing or underemphasized for you in liberalism? Does that make sense?
Yeah, there's the transcendent, but it's not just the transcendent. It's also about human relationships, and the question whether the cash nexus, to use Marx's term, is really the paradigm of paradigms for human relationships. Whether all human relationships should be understood in the same way that economic transactions are understood. And if the question is that certain things that are important to humans psychologically are missed out when those are the only kinds of transactions that are considered legitimate, how do you fill in those gaps that have been created by liberalism's sort of monolithic, emphasis on market-like forms of relationships?
Wow. You know who you sound exactly like, except in tone, inflection, style, and accent, is Cornel West. Do you know, have you heard him say what you just said about...
I haven't heard him say it, but I know that, Cornel West has, certain friends on the right that find him and his worldview to be, within the same sort of structural universe as their own, if not the same substantive universe.
Well, it's like it's a variant of Christian socialism. So when I say Cornel West, I really mean you sound like a Christian socialist right there, because... Well,
and Christianity, I think, and socialism are both, of course, the two of the major streams of criticism of liberalism. So that's one reason why I think all these things tend to sound kind of similar, although the similarities don't necessarily imply, I think, a commitment to, either socialism or Christianity, let alone Christian socialism.
I just remember Cornell giving this amazing speech, even though I didn't agree with it, just about how market relations have found their way into all of our human relations. Every intimate detail of our relationships is somehow determined by the market, and money is the only measure of value. And he just was saying very much what you're saying. And of course, he comes out of the church and he's very much a Christian and all that. And so I'm trying to get at whether that's true. I don't actually, and I'm the biggest opponent of contemporary liberalism there is, so I have nothing good to say about it. But I actually do think they are committed to transcendent values and things and ideas, concepts, beliefs, articles of faith, even that I do think unify or could unify people. For one thing, aren't they all nationalists, just like Donald Trump is and Steve Bannon? Don't they all believe in America first, actually, in that America should lead the world? I mean, it's not this sort of calling them globalists. I understand the argument, but I don't think it's quite right. To me, they're American globalists. They want...
No, I don't think there's anything specifically American about them, right? I mean, they're
Really?
very happy to have... Oh, absolutely not.
Okay.
Well, I mean, American maybe in the sense that the Americans are the leading edge of the spear, right? But not in that, you would have the same sort of globalist impulses among the, many European elites, among, the British elite. They're just as happy to sign on to this American imperial project as America's own leadership class is. And the idea is basically to take the nation state and say, well, you know what, the nation state is really just a stepping stone to having an entire world order. In fact, the liberal international order, the liberal world order, George H.W. Bush called it the New World Order, which then gets picked up by conspiracists. But all of this, it's describing something that, really is an objective and a sort of vision of the good world that I think liberals broadly sign on to. And again, neoconservatives sign on to it. Humanitarian interventionist Democrats sign on to it. And libertarians tend to sign on to a variant of it as well.
Right. But don't you think, well, I mean, I think this is a statement of fact, actually. Haven't all those people justified the expansion of the American empire and what you would call globalism as extensions of America's goodness to other people?
No, what they say is that we are only an exceptional nation in that our ideas are universal. So every other, nation is non-universal, but our nationalism is uniquely non-national. It's universal, and these ideas can work and will work everywhere if only the tyrannical institutions that prevent them from taking hold in places like Iraq or Afghanistan can be destroyed by our force. And once that's destroyed, people will naturally fit into the same pattern that Americans themselves fit into. Because again, there's this universalistic idea about, human motives and human drives, which says that really what we want is just freedom to consume. And both of those elements count. It's not just consumption itself, but really it is freedom to consume. And of course, that freedom to consume winds up being guided and tutored by certain people who might be said to be taste setters or have a degree of moral and intellectual influence above, the masses. And that's where I think liberalism is actually a bit of a fraud, because even though it defines itself as being consumerist and defines itself as being predicated on democracy, in fact, there's always this tutelary class of leaders and experts and scientists who stand above the masses and are really responsible for making sure that what they consume is what's good for them.
Okay, so America is propositional, right? We know this. It's a country based upon an idea. That's what makes us unique, right? Is that what you're getting at? So an idea is, by definition, universal. It can be universally applied anywhere. In other words, the country wasn't based on some hereditary monarchy that is traced to a particular family that was born in this particular place. It's not based on the soil, the place. It's an idea. All men are created equal, right?
And even there, you can take as I think the founders themselves did, you could take the principles of the Declaration of Independence and say, the Declaration does talk about when it's necessary for one people to separate itself from another, which does imply that there are, certain groups that people can form politically, which can be distinct from one another, and that you don't have to have everything consolidated into a single order. And even if one set of founding principles for a country are considered universally correct, it doesn't necessarily mean that they can be applied everywhere all at the same time. Whereas I think the tendency among America's leadership class now, which is broadly a liberal leadership class, is to say, actually, these universal principles do apply everywhere more or less immediately. And we can bring about a world that is, a liberal international order that is, and they see it as bringing a great blessing to the entire planet. But of course, these blessings are attached to high explosives as well.
So yes, we found out. Now the missiles have rainbow flags on them, though, so it's fine. But isn't the idea that all men are created equal essentially an American idea, since it's the first and only country to be based upon that idea?
No,
Hmm.
the ideas of the Declaration have an antecedent in Locke, and they have an antecedent beyond that, arguably, in Christian ideas about human dignity, and maybe particularly Protestant ideas also about ecclesiology, church organization. So there are various layers here. But even if the ideas, first came to fruition in an American context, it doesn't necessarily mean that therefore only America, that only America could succeed with these ideas. I mean, they could be things that really are universal, and that we just happen to be the lucky sort of first place to come to a clear understanding of these thoughts, and subsequently everyone else can now be helped by us. But the idea again is that fundamentally this is where human nature leads, and that this really isn't just something that adventitiously happens in one particular place or in one set of circumstances, but that if our human nature were allowed to express itself without any kind of artificial barriers or historical baggage, that you would always get something that looks like America.
Yeah, right, for sure. That's definitely been the argument.
And this is why, of course, people like Locke say in the beginning, all the world was America. They're trying to say that, and Rousseau as well. I mean, again, this is, I think there's quite a long progressive chain of thought here, which says that if you could only go back to the Garden of Eden, we could get it right this time.
Right.
Whereas the conservative thought is, no, there's a reason why the Garden of Eden turned out the way it did. And in fact, things are going to keep turning out that way.
And the problem that Locke said, that he identified, was the existence of sovereigns on fertile land that weren't doing anything with that fertile land to make it productive or commercial. And so he says in many different essays that it is the obligation, it is the duty for the hardworking, industrious, productive man to take control of that land where the savage Indians are sitting and to make it productive. It is our obligation to take over that land. And that land then should belong as property to the productive man. That's in Locke. So to me, and then Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, I read that as an imperialist document. Now I'm kind of agreeing with you here, because he says not just that all men are created equal. To me, in that, if you read the whole thing, it's not crystal clear, but it sure looks like there's an injunction he's giving us. He's saying that we really not only can overthrow our despots, but that we should. And that we should probably aid people who are facing despotic regimes too, or live under despotic regimes as well. But because it's, as you're saying, it is this universal idea, right? Why should we only apply it to people who live within the boundaries of the United States? If you're reading that declaration, if you're reading that document, you would have to think globally. There is nothing, you're right, there's nothing specific to the United States of America or any part of the world in that document, nor, you're right, in much of the thinking of the founders around these issues. And by the way,
you did have, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and then I don't know if you know this, but Charles Sumner, I think it was either during or immediately after the Civil War, said that the Civil War and Reconstruction were the fulfillment, it must have been after, were the fulfillment of the Declaration of Independence, right? Which a lot of people see the Civil War as an imperialist war, which I do too, right? It's imposing. It was a military occupation of then a foreign country and the remaking of it in the image of the northern United States, right?
Well, one person who says that is, in fact, the director Ang Lee, who is, I think, a Taiwanese American.
Oh.
And his film Ride with the Devil, which touches on, these kinds of conflicts. He said in one interview, and it may actually be on the commentary on the Criterion version of the film, but he says, that he views the Civil War as being a war of imperialism by the North, or at least he sees that as being one of its dimensions. And now that said, and
justified by the Declaration of Independence, though. That's what Sumner was saying. This is what the Declaration of Independence called for. And he also suggests strongly that it does not limit itself to the South, that the Declaration of Independence also calls for us to go elsewhere in the world and remake the rest of the world in our image too. We are proud to once again be sponsored by Paloma Verde CBD, a fantastic independent CBD company based in San Antonio, Texas, owned and operated by Carlos and Vanessa Abelar. They now have a new website, so go check that out at palomaverdestore.com. And while you're there, unless you're an idiot, you're going to buy a lot of products because they give you 25% off as an unregistered listener. 25% off for us, just us, on everything in their store. And they're so generous on top of that, you get another 10% off if you just join their mailing list. Also, they've put together my 3 favorite Paloma Verde store products into what's called the Unregistered Combo Pack, but we like to call it the Thad Pack because I'm narcissistic. That includes their gummies, 10 milligrams of CBD in every delicious fruit-flavored gummy. I eat them like candy because that's what they taste like. Their soft gels, 25 milligrams per soft gel. I take several per day. They help me a lot, especially for me with anxiety and insomnia. But my favorite thing, which I talk about all the damn time, is their high-potency, fast-acting tincture. You put a few drops under your tongue, and again, you'll feel the worries, the tension, the anxiety, the sleeplessness melt away. Go to palomaverdestore.com, use the discount code RENEGADE, get 25% off everything, 10% off if you join their mailing list, and the Unregistered Combo Pack, the Thad Pack, that's 33% off. So go there, buy a lot of products, make your life feel better, make your body better, and I thank you.
This, I think, is there were different views about this even during the founding, and there continue to be different views, throughout American history. So when it comes to the French Revolution, people like Jefferson saw the French Revolution as being something that really was an extension of the American Revolution, or at least the principles that underlay it. Whereas, most of the Federalists saw the French Revolution as being something that was a much more dramatic departure. I think the Declaration of Independence is actually very carefully composed and doesn't have quite the same sort of universalistic revolutionary tendency that a lot of people read into it. And remember, of course, half or 2/3 of the Declaration is a list of particular grievances that the American colonists are leveling against the King of England. And I actually read the Declaration as not saying that the King of England is illegitimate in England. It's rather saying, okay, the King of England gave some of his people the permission to go and settle in America. Then he created governments for them through, grants to proprietors and things like that. However, this deal is now void because the king has done X, Y, and Z. He's incited Indians to attack us. He has, failed to defend us against, other enemies. He has quartered troops in our houses, all sorts of violations there are particular legal complaints about what the king has done. And so as a result, you can go back to the original contract of government, the original idea of, how do you get a free government in the first place? And you can annul that for the American colonists. You can say, we've decided we are a separate people from the British, from the English, and we now say that we don't want to have this government connection with you through the king. Therefore, the king is no longer our king. We've never had any connection with Parliament because we never had representation in Parliament. Mm-hmm. And so that's how American independence is brought about. And I think this was important, too, because if you look at how Whigs in England would have received this, they, were very, very worried about the power that the king might have been wielding. And they wanted to see the king's power limited in England as well. But they didn't endorse the idea of a revolution against the king or anything like that. So I think the American Declaration of Independence, while it does rest on certain radical philosophical premises, is actually not, advocating a worldwide revolution. It is simply saying, here's a principle which a people can choose to use or not in the circumstances that they happen to be in.
It just so happens that the Declaration of Independence wasn't just used to justify the Civil War and Reconstruction. It's been used to justify every foreign intervention by the United States since the founding.
That's true. And of course, that's going to be true of any kind of national mythology, right? So anytime any country goes to war, it's probably going to invoke whatever it sees as being, the true essence of, its being as the justification for running roughshod over other people.
Well,
and by the way, and with respect to, the Civil War, I am, just as my ancestors actually physically were, I am on the side of the North there. And although I think there are, qualms to be raised about parts of how the North conducted the war, in the end, I'm not a believer in the idea that, slavery was on the road to extinction by itself, or that that you could have the kind of divided sovereignty as well as the moral divisions over slavery that the United States had and endure. I think you had to have ultimately, it was a form of nationalism, and it was a justified form of nationalism.
Do you believe that Edmund Burke would have agreed with you if he had lived to see that?
Oh, I tend to think so. Burke was not a supporter of slavery, and he recognized that America had some internal divisions. The reason why he saw America having to divide from Britain is because the Americans already had a very different kind of personality from the British. With regard to the Civil War, I think he would have understood, first of all, that there was a reason for it, that you did have these divisions between North and South. But I think also the character of the South would have been something that horrified him to the point where he would probably have supported the North.
Yeah, but I thought.
But that's very conjectural, of course.
No, of course. But I thought Burke was all about allowing traditions to evolve organically rather than being shaped coercively from external forces.
I think it's a mistake to take conservatism as meaning that whatever exists, because it has evolved organically, must be good.
Right.
Rather, I think the conservative point of view, and you can kind of see this in philosophers like Roger Scruton and the late David Stove, what conservatism says is that you should have a predisposition to think that the good things that you already have, and you know they're good, by reasoning or perhaps by revelation. They're not good just because they exist, but the things that you have that exist that are good are more easily lost than you can obtain new things that are, equally good or better. So it doesn't mean that you never have change. It doesn't mean that everything that exists is good. It just means that you are, sort of acutely feel the danger of what's going to be lost if you try to change things rapidly or dramatically. And of course, it would have been superior if America had been able to eliminate slavery and eliminate the problems that led to the Civil War, even beyond slavery, which are, divided sovereignty was something that would always be a principle of civil conflict. If it had been able to manage these difficulties without, having an actual very bloody military conflict. But for various reasons, I think that was unlikely to be the case.
So there's Burkean conservatives, there's classical conservatives, which is usually the same thing. And I'm wondering if and then there's paleo conservatives who also tend to sound like the same people. Now, correct me if I'm wrong there, but a lot of people I know of as paleos are on my side on the Civil War question and not on yours. Am I right that there's an argument?
Oh, that's right. Yeah. Yeah.
There is an argument among your faction, your comrades in classical conservatism over the Civil War, right?
That's right. Yeah. And I would say that, people who might be more apt to identify themselves as reactionaries would probably be, sort of more favorable towards the Southern cause. But also there is, a certain amount of, Irving Kristol, the godfather of neoconservatism, and who, sort of happily accepted the label, which is unusual for most conservatives, neoconservatives, I should say. Irving Kristol once said that he kind of, respected the paleoconservatives as literary figures, as people who had a romantic vision. He just thought they were, sort of inept and mistaken when it came to politics. And you often see that there's this element of romanticism that creeps into a certain kind of politics on the right. I think the paleos have a thread of that. And I think actually Burke is not quite, Burke is more sophisticated than that. Burke uses romanticism, but he knows what he's doing, and he's not simply under the spell himself. I've done a review of Andrew Bacevich's book for the Library of America called American Conservatism, A Tradition Rediscovered, I believe. Fantastic. I've reviewed this for the Claremont Review of Books. It's coming out, the print version's out now. It'll be on the web soon. But in there, I talk about, some of these romantic tendencies in conservatism, which I think are reflected in Bacevich's book, and why I think they are, sort of inadequate and mistaken.
Now, the major two American figures in classical conservatism, am I right, are Russell Kirk and James Burnham. Is that right? Well,
Russell Kirk, certainly. James Burnham didn't always, I think, call himself a conservative, but he's a titanic figure, certainly.
What did they have to say about the Civil War and Reconstruction?
Well, Kirk was generally sympathetic to the South, but not in ways that would make him seem like a neo-Confederate or something like that. So with Kirk, it's something that he tends not to talk about explicitly in the terms that some of the more sort of gung-ho paleoconservatives would.
Right.
But it's clear that Kirk thought the whole thing was tragic and perhaps could have been averted, and he has a deep sympathy with with the idea of a Southern culture that was somewhat less commercial than Northern culture was.
Right.
James Burnham, on the other hand, while I don't recall anything specific that he may have said about the Civil War, he very much was, someone who understood the tendency of the world in the late 19th century, mid 19th century, toward national consolidation along industrial lines. And I think he would have said that what would happen with the Civil War was inevitable, because if you have this slave agrarian economy to the South, which was not perfectly agrarian, it was obviously quite industrialized in its own sense, but it's competing with a real industrial power up north, which has sort of the beginnings of railroads and other new forms of military and commercial technology, which are just going to completely overwhelm the South. And culturally too, the kinds of cultures and values that you tend to get reflected by that kind of Northern society and that kind of Southern society are going to come into conflict. Burnham, I think, on that question, would have borrowed a lot from Marx, because he had been a Marxist earlier in his career.
Now, okay, so for the record, I'm none of those things, paleo, Burkean, or classical conservative, although I respect all three. My position is not that there was something valuable about the South, although there might be. I'm agnostic on that question. I don't really care. I'm not defending or promoting or denigrating the South, the old South. I'm insisting that we identify it for what it is, the Civil War, which was an act of imperialism. And especially Reconstruction is like colonial imperialism. I mean, it seems to me indisputable. Is that true for you, or is that not true? That's what that was. That's the category we should place over the Civil War and Reconstruction.
I think the difficulty that Reconstruction encountered, and really its failure, is a sign of how very, very difficult it is to have nation building, right? So our nation building in the 20th and 21st century proceeds along this idea that we can reconstruct, any kind of culture, any kind of society. And of course, if we had difficulty doing that in our own country, and the South was not completely alien to the North. I mean, it was a war between brothers in quite a literal sense in many cases. If even Reconstruction in the South was a rather difficult thing, and it involved military control and so forth, you have to look at what we're trying to do in places like Afghanistan or Iraq and say that's going to be a hell of a lot harder. So I think there is, in terms of the pattern of things, not necessarily trying to get into the rights or wrongs, but just saying what happened. It's a war between an industrial state, and a less industrialized one. It creates a national consolidation afterwards. This is a very familiar pattern in 19th century history.
Yeah. Okay. I didn't expect it all to go down that path with you, but I am fascinated by it, and thank you for doing that.
Yeah, and again, I think the justice of things is different from kind of the material and political tendencies of things. And there again, I think Burnham and his involvement with Marx is actually a valuable thing, because it helps us to think about these things, and other than just sort of you should apply moral terms, but you shouldn't apply moral terms so immediately that you wind up just being propagandistic and saying these are the good guys, these are the bad guys, there's nothing to be thought about here. Instead, you should try to understand the levels that are not moral, and then you can make moral judgments about the entire picture.
Right. Yes, agreed 100%. I always say the South was the first Afghanistan, but we can leave it there. Let's get back to contemporary politics. So, and back to this nationalist populist beast. So, as I'm watching the War Room with Steve Bannon and company, and they're talking, most of it is anathema to my politics. They talk a lot about, especially lately, they've been talking a lot about Christianity and the attack on Christianity that's allegedly going on in this country. Well, actually, let's pause right there. First of all, is that true? Do you think that's happening? Is there an attack on Christianity?
There's a replacement of the Christian understanding of humanity, but with a new understanding of humanity. I think that's certainly happening.
Okay.
And it's happening across institutions. It's happening even within Christianity itself, which I think is one of the interesting developments.
Now, what do you mean by that? Unpack that. What's the difference here? What's being replaced with what?
Well, a Christian understanding of humanity says that the most important thing about us is our relationship with God. We've been created in God's image, and that implies a certain dignity within us. That dignity is something we can actually injure, right? So there's this tendency for the post-Christian view to say we kind of own ourselves. Autonomy is, the highest value. Although even there, I think there's a little bit of sly smuggling of other values in there, but at least not notionally, autonomy is one of the highest values for liberalism. And so the idea that you could injure yourself by doing something that is, contrary to your dignity is doesn't make sense from a liberal point of view. It's not part of it. Doesn't. It's not a contradiction in human nature. Whereas for the Christian, there really is such a thing as abusing yourself or behaving in ways that are falling short of your potential, falling short of your what it means to be created in God's image. And so as liberalism becomes very pervasive in our culture, I think you've seen a number of churches adopt essentially the liberal point of view of human nature, as opposed to the old Christian point of view of human nature. They'll still talk about God, but it'll be God, that winds up absolutely affirming whatever individual autonomy wishes to express, whether in terms of gender or in terms of, sort of personal interests. All of that now can be understood in terms of God wanting you to be you instead of God wanting you to be like God.
Okay, so there's, I mean, understand this. So Christianity has this idea that God places within us dignity, what you're calling dignity, human dignity, that is apart from human consciousness, I suppose. And liberals are saying that it's not, it's socially determined. In other, is that dignity is socially determined by liberals, right? Not by God. Is that?
Well, I mean, they would say that it's an essential component of humanity, that it's not socially determined. It's just, a non-negotiable aspect of our being human, because we have the ability to reason, or for, more.
Who says this? Christians or liberals?
Liberals will say this.
Liberals.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. At least, if they're Kantian, if they are, adhere to various Enlightenment ideas, this is an idea that there is something so, unique about human consciousness that it justifies a panoply of rights and the freedom to be whatever you want to be.
Okay.
At least that's what they claim.
Okay.
That they stand for.
Right.
In practice, there's some manipulation involved, but that's at least the selling point.
Okay.
Whereas with Christianity, it's that God has created us and has given us free will. But because we have that free will, we can therefore choose to defy God's commandments to us. And instead of doing what God orders, and what God orders is not because he's a tyrant, but rather because what he orders is actually what's good. If we defy what God orders, then we are sinning, and we are, sort of, first of all, injuring our relationship with God. We're also injuring our own nature, and we're also, eventually injuring, the whole of humanity.
And which of God's orders do you believe liberals are calling us to violate?
Well, they just don't believe that God's orders are any different from the orders that we give ourselves as autonomous individuals. I think that's the bottom line for them. Oh. So there can never be any kind of, you think about the 7 deadly sins in Christianity, things like lust and anger, pride, etc. Most of those things, maybe anger is still a vice for liberals. Although even anger, I think, anger is a complicated story, but things like lust, it can't really be a bad thing in liberalism unless it's lust that carries over into non-consensual force. Pride is almost certainly something that liberals would say is a good thing, and unless again it turns into an actual, sort of overbearing against other people. But that is it. That you have this sort of a barrier between one person and another that cannot be crossed. But otherwise, whatever happens within the person itself is totally legitimate. That's all up to you.
Gosh, I have a different reading of liberalism.
Well, tell me yours.
I think it's a secular form of Christianity, meaning the moral structure is essentially the same to me. They just took out the supernatural stuff, the metaphysical stuff, which is not unimportant, but that's, to me, the moral structure is the most important thing. In other words, how should we organize society is essentially, liberals have had essentially the same answer that Christians have had.
I tend to agree up to a point with that. I think you're right that, and this is what's happened, right? It's replaced the idea of what God tells us to do with whatever we supposedly tell ourselves to do through autonomy. Now, that winds up not working, right? Because people are not so godlike for the most part.
Right.
They don't, people do feel confusions. They feel ambiguities. They're not sure, whether they, want to go into one profession or go into another. Or they're not sure whether they should approve or disapprove of some moral action. So they wind up getting instructions from someplace. And the question is, well, where are those instructions coming from? Liberalism, sells a bill of goods under the name of autonomy. But in fact, as you've alluded to, I think what it's actually providing is a kind of conformity where there is a degree of, sort of not just conformity to the masses socially, but actually a degree of manipulation by people who consider themselves to be scientifically or otherwise, sort of epistemically more advanced and more correct and ultimately better than and above the rest of humanity. So all of that has replaced the older idea that God is the one who gives you these instructions. But you're right that liberalism emerges out of a certain change in Christianity. And one of the things I think is happening now is that a lot of liberal Christians are re-importing liberalism into Christianity in ways that they don't recognize. And in fact, this even carries over perhaps to many relatively conservative or sort of center-right conservative Christians.
Yeah. So selflessness, self-abnegation, even, to me, is at the center of both Christianity and liberalism. So Paul, in Epistle to Romans, says, we must sacrifice our bodies upon the altar to God, essentially. Depends on the translation. And liberals say we must sacrifice our own individual freedom and I'm talking about modern liberals, sacrifice our own freedom and pleasures for the community, usually, almost always the nation state, right?
Well, but when liberals say that, I mean, they don't say that, right? They don't say that we have to sacrifice our, happiness or our pleasure or our bodies or whatever for the community. They say that by doing this, by investing so much power in the community and by limiting our first order desires, the community will actually deliver even more for what we desire, right? So it's, I think that's the kind of manipulative element that's a bit sophisticated in liberalism. But ultimately, it's saying that it's not because community is inherently good, or that something like the nation state certainly is not inherently good for liberalism. Rather, it's saying that these things may be instrumental necessities for humanity to have as much pleasure or as much prosperity, as much well-being as it could possibly have.
Okay.
And again, that's where you have this epistemic elite, which says, well, we understand this, but of course, you, as a regular voter, you can't possibly understand it. So you can have certain freedoms, but ultimately, we're going to draw a line and decide what can be taught to you, what books you can read, what books Amazon.com should sell. Because again, if you get the wrong ideas in your head, your autonomy might lead you to choose things that we won't want you to choose.
It's the new priesthood.
I think that's totally right. There's this argument going on about whether liberalism has become a religion. A lot of my friends say that it hasn't. I think it actually has, and exactly right, that there is a priesthood, there is a clerisy, which says its knowledge has to be what morally guides everyone else.
Oh, yeah. And it has monasteries, too, known as universities.
It has monasteries. It operates, in the same way, not necessarily as like medieval Christianity, but in the same way that moral disapprobation, if you violated Christian tenets, once had a powerful social stigma and could have cost you your livelihood, could have cost you, could have made you a pariah in society. Now liberalism applies those very same powers against people who wind up falling afoul of liberal theology. And it really is theological too, because it's extremely liberalism today. If you look at the tripwires, you look at the things people get in trouble for. I mean, it's things you could never have imagined. It's just like violating the idea of the Trinity. The Trinity is not an intuitive idea. It's something that Scripture kind of touches upon lightly, and then the church had to sort of have a council in order to define and promulgate. Liberalism today has these tripwires which would never have imagined. Oh, okay, this is the right way to talk about gender, and not this way that's slightly different, but still trying to be accepting or whatever. No, that won't cut it. You have to do exactly the right formula. It really is kind of theologically precise.
Yeah, right. Like with pronouns, for instance, right?
With pronouns, yeah. Or with latinx, I mean, you've got to have the right the right declension or the right, ending to your nouns.
Which, what is it? 90% of Latino people think it's terrible.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. But again, if the epistemic elite has decided that this is what morality requires, who cares if actual Latinos hate it?
The epistemic elite; those are the people who know what is truth.
Yeah, there is a really important election analysis that came out. I think it was an interview in New York Magazine with David Shore, who is a Democratic pollster. And Shore himself got in trouble. I forget what he got canceled about a few months ago, but he fell afoul of political correctness. And he has, I think, the best analysis of the 2020 election. And he points out that, this education divide really is the key thing right now.
Yes.
And what cost Donald Trump the election in 2020 was highly educated whites.
Yes.
And there really was, and it was not just, because Donald Trump spent a lot of money courting Hispanics in Florida. There really was a drift of Hispanics in a large way and blacks to a lesser extent towards Donald Trump. And part of it, I think, is explained by these educational differences.
Yes.
And white liberalism is very much a religion of the epistemic elite. It's something that Americans who are not part of the epistemic elite, I think, are starting to recognize is just hates them and just despises them and looks down upon them. So
I've been saying for 5 years, I'm taking credit for this. No one else gets credit for this. I've been saying for 5 years that what we are seeing is a civil war between people who went to college and are of college, the culture of college, and people who are not of the culture of college.
Yeah, I think that's totally true. And again, there are people who are highly educated who reject that college mentality, that ideology that's been inculcated.
Like Donald Trump.
Like Donald Trump, yeah, and like all the mini Trumps right now. Someone like Ron DeSantis, his degrees are from Harvard and Yale.
Yeah.
Hawley from Missouri also, has Ivy League credentials.
Yep.
And, there's a bit of phoniness to, all these guys, but it's not all phony. And just because they have these credentials doesn't mean that they're necessarily cut from the same cloth as, their fellow students might have been.
Yeah, no, it's really remarkable. I mean, having spent the bulk of my life inside universities and in that culture, and unfortunately partly promulgating it myself, I'm sad to say, I'm very familiar with it. And I'm very familiar that half the country roughly has no idea what the hell we're talking about and finds it either just indecipherable or offensive, because it almost always includes not a critique, but an expressed fear and revulsion of essentially white working class people and their culture. Right?
Yeah, and I think all working class people and their culture ultimately.
Yeah, although, but they're not allowed. They're not allowed to say that they dislike the way that Black and Latino working class people spend their leisure time.
Right.
Yeah, right. But we know
they certainly will say that, about white people who want to watch a NASCAR race or something.
No doubt about it. Yes, exactly. So, all right. So I'm still wondering how you fit with this national populist stuff, because so I watched The War Room. They talk a lot about Christianity, traditional values. They talk about the family at the center of conservative thought, right? Nuclear family, right? Nation. They're nationalists first. They are hostile to these globalist, which is true, elites who come from these monasteries that are this new religion, that are not actually religion, that are fake religion. They want to protect America from foreign trade, from foreign people who will change the culture radically. They want to protect America from radical egalitarian ideas, the way that Burke wanted to protect not just France, but the world from the radical egalitarian ideals of the Jacobins. Again, these guys, Daniel, they sound like you. They sound like classical conservatives. What am I missing? You are a Trumper. You need to be a Trumper, no?
Well, I voted for him twice, so I think that's...
Did you? Oh, okay, I got it right. Okay, I didn't know. I got it right.
I've only voted for, since I cast my first ballot in 1996. And in that time, I've only voted for the Republican nominee on 3 occasions. And 2 of those were Donald Trump, and the other one was Bob Dole back in 96.
Oh, wow.
The other times, I either voted third party or wrote someone in, or I voted for John Kerry in 2004, which is a fact.
Because
as a friend of mine correctly pointed out, that was the ultimate protest vote against Bush and the neocons.
I was going to say, so because you're a big anti-war guy, I'm guessing, did you vote for Bob Dole because he called all the wars of the 20th century Democrat wars? Democrat wars? That's my favorite line from any politician. The Democrat
Wasn't it? It's a great line. I mean, it really, is something that should prompt people to think. And it's not well enough known, but yeah. I wasn't really aware of that back in 1996. I was 18 years old.
Okay.
But I was a Buchananite even back then. But of course,
really?
Buchanan had lost the Republican nomination that year. So
right.
Bob Dole seemed fair enough.
Okay. So I didn't know you were as pro-Trump is that? Okay, that's fascinating.
Well, I'm pro-Trump. That doesn't mean I think he walks on water or anything like that. And
well, of course,
I'm actually sort of, on the one hand, I kind of get where people are coming from when they talk about a sort of cult-like view of Trump.
Mhm.
You do find people who are like that. But on the other hand, I remember very cult-like attitudes towards George W. Bush and Barack Obama. This incantation of "he kept us safe, he kept us safe." No, the worst terrorist attack in American history happened under George W. Bush, and then a lot of shit happened after that too. So,
right.
it was just sheer, sort of worship of the imperial cult there. Whereas Donald Trump, I think a lot of people, it's not even necessarily that they think he walks in water. They just love the fact that he says the things that can't be said, and he represents a side of the American psyche and a portion of the American public that otherwise can't be expressed. And the liberals will go out there and say, "Oh, that's just the racist portion. That's the hateful portion." None of that is actually true. I mean, if you actually look at Trump's policies, and people can argue about immigration, but of course Biden is doing kids in cages and all that stuff as well. The Trump years were great for African Americans. They were great for Latinos. COVID, of course, was awful for everyone. But no, I mean, what Trump does is he expresses a certain, psychological element, which liberalism doesn't want to have expressed. And that element is, in some ways, it's skeptical, it's defiant of piety, it's irreligious, you might say, not towards Christianity, but towards this new, more powerful religion of liberalism. And Trump, just makes people feel a little bit freer and a little bit, sort of more proud to be American, not in a sort of jingoistic or chauvinistic way, but just in a sense that, you don't have to just have this complex theology of victimhood that you have to have on your mind 24 hours a day and think about your particular place within the great chain of oppression. You can actually be a Trumpian and say, "Hey, you know what? Our country's done all right. It's got, it's good to be an American. People are well off here, and they can be proud of what they've achieved and proud of their, place as free citizens."
Yeah. That's fascinating. So Trump talks about his feelings. His decision-making is explicitly guided by his feelings often. He talks in speeches about his feelings, about politics, about people, about things, right? Feelings are anarchic, right? And usually somewhat spontaneous, if not totally spontaneous, and certainly in Trump they are, right? But they're anarchic, and that's why they've been kept out of political discourse so rigorously, right? You have not been allowed to express your feelings as a politician in this country until now. Now, most of the feelings are anger, but not all. And that is precisely, I think, what I value about Trump the most, is that he gets up on stage and he talks from, I mean, this sounds like it's a cliche, but it's true, talks from his heart. And that in itself, almost, it doesn't matter what comes out, that in itself is a threat to the establishment, because as I said, it's anarchic and spontaneous, and we don't know where it's going to go. So if you're trying to keep the big ship of state floating in the same direction, you don't want a captain who's thinking with his feelings.
That's right. It's like a Brave New World. I mean, you're allowed to have feelings, you're allowed to have sex, but it has to be safe sex. Your feelings have to be, attuned to the whole system. If you are John the Savage, who hasn't been raised in the right conditions, and you've read Shakespeare, you're a real disruptive element and something that has to be exiled. And of course, you talk about anger, but think about all the other emotions that are expressed during a Trump rally. Think about the soundtrack, for example. This is a guy who goes out to YMCA.
I love that.
The Village People. He plays Elton John. This is not anger music, right? I mean, who the heck thinks of that as being a music of hatred and hostility?
Yeah.
And think about the times when Trump talks about love, which really, really upsets liberals. So during the January 6th riot at the Capitol, when Donald Trump finally, goes on Twitter, which he then gets yanked from, but he goes on Twitter and he actually tries to calm and defuse the situation. What does he tell the rioters? Well, what does he tell, the whole protest? But I think the rioters are included in this. The rioters were a small number, of course, of the actual people who showed up on January 6th. Yep. But Donald Trump says, "We love you." That's like, wow. I mean, whoever thought you'd hear and the liberals say, "Oh, well, he's endorsing the violence because he says that." No, he's telling them to go home. He told them before the riot to protest peacefully, to make their voices heard, but he didn't tell them to invade the Capitol.
Mm-hmm.
And now he's saying, I understand your feelings, and I love you, but you need to stop doing this.
Yeah.
And that's it. That's what someone should say. You should certainly, one way or another, right? I mean, you could try to do it the other way and command people, but I don't think Donald Trump actually had the ability to command what was happening in the riot. I mean, it's clear to me that, one of the crazy things is that liberals think Donald Trump is as far to the crazy side of things as the world can get. And in fact, there's way crazier stuff out there. And Donald Trump is in part a prisoner of a dynamic as much as actually more than he is a creator of a certain dynamic. And then if you, his CPAC speech, which was just very long, almost Castro-like in places, but in places he would talk about how the Republican Party is becoming a party of love. And it wasn't just the typical BS, scripted focus group stuff. It really had some heft to it, some meaning. And I think Donald Trump would actually be more effective if he did a little more of that more often.
Mm-hmm.
But when he has done it, I think it's been quite powerful.
Yes, well put. That was fascinating. I was also thinking as you were talking that one of the things that struck me about what I see from Bannon and his people and Trump is they often sound like Marxists. I mean, they are very attuned to class. They use the term working class, which you weren't allowed to use that term if you talked about politics in America until about 5 years ago, right? Working class wasn't a category that Americans used to describe anyone in our own country, right? And they freely do. They talk about the Republic. They're talking about the Republican Party right now becoming or being the party of the American working class. That language has only been used by the Socialist Workers' Party and the Communist Party in the past.
Sort of, although if you think about it, there were variations on that theme during the Reagan years and during Nixon, both of whom, Pat Buchanan, who of course was an advisor to both of them, but especially Nixon,
right.
Would talk about sort of the lunch pail voter.
Yeah.
And, the whole, silent majority and things like that.
George Wallace.
Not quite as well. George Wallace used to use those kinds of terms
very
too.
much so, yeah.
And there were, antecedents before then also.
Sure.
And the left, of course, liberals tend to look at these things and just say racism. But no, these are getting at, they're getting at the class dimension or the educational dimension, the intellectual dimension, the ideological dimension of class.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's difficult for intellectuals to wrap their minds around. When you talk about class, you can say, well, look, some of these people are rich. Some of them are not working class, or some of the working class may have progressive views. That's irrelevant. I mean, it's the conjunction between the ideas and the economic status and how those interrelate.
Yes.
That's the key thing. And that was even the key thing for Marx, of course. Marx was not an idiot about this either. But we tend to have a very oversimplified view of the relationship between ideas and class.
Class is not just an economic category, it's also a cultural category. I've been saying this for decades, right? And I think it's more important as a cultural category. Go ask a cashier at CVS what class she belongs to. She will not say working class. Again, Americans don't use this. Europeans talk about that, but Americans don't talk about that. And she could subscribe to a long list of values that anybody would associate squarely with bourgeois, middle class, European and American culture, right? The family, the nation, God, working hard, being a good citizen, obeying the law, deferring to authority, all those things, right? Those ideas can be and have been held by people who are clearly economically working class in this country.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then,
in fact, that of course is the thing that unwound Marxism, is that it had this idea that you would have international solidarity among the working class, and you don't. You always had, the working class has been the most nationalist element most of the time,
right.
of any population segment.
Just look at our favorite Marxist Bernie Sanders, right? Who's a nationalist populist. Also, no one wants to talk about that, but Bernie was, and still he just doesn't talk about it anymore, totally opposed to immigration, probably more so than Trump, right? And because he wants the American working class to do well. Apparently, he doesn't care so much about the Mexican working class or the Central American working class who really want to make better money up here, but it's another story.
Well, I think, I'm not sure exactly what he would say to that criticism. I do think in some ways, Bernie may be in keeping with the tradition of the founding fathers, right? So he may have a universal desire for Central America to be prosperous as well, but we are responsible for our own, political community. And so that means he's responsible for America. He's not responsible for what happens in Guatemala or Mexico.
Right. It's just not very Marxist of him, is all I'm saying.
No, certainly not. I think you're right about that. And I mean, I think there's a reason why Trump would often people would say, "Oh, it's just cynical. Trump wants Bernie to be the Democratic nominee because he thinks he's going to beat Bernie." There may be an element of that, but I think there was also some sincere appreciation on the part of Trump for Bernie, as indeed I think there is among the Trumpist elements in the Republican Party. Obviously they're very socialist, anti Sanders people, but there are also people who they're still anti-socialist, but they think that Bernie is more of a patriot perhaps than he would let on.
Oh, I can see lots of potential for coalition politics between the Trump faction and the Bernie faction. I can see them working together on a lot of bills in Congress and passing a lot of laws if they actually got their act together. Don't you?
It's happened a little bit. Josh Hawley had some Democratic admirers until he protested against the election irregularities. By the way, wasn't that ironic that here you have the Democrats saying, well, if you have someone like Josh Hawley saying that he's going to reject electors or call into question electors, that is a form of overturning an election. That is, a kind of revolutionary insurrectionist thing to do. When in fact, Democrats had done the same thing in the House. They didn't have any senators on their side at the time, but they did tried it in the House in 2000, 2004, and 2016. And including some of the House managers of the second impeachment were people who had tried to throw out electors from Ohio. So again, the whole propaganda, the whole myth that was constructed after January 6th and instantly constructed, which was very interesting how quickly it evolved, was bullshit. And, Josh Hawley is someone that I think he tries a lot of things, and most of them are, kind of goofy in times. But I give him credit actually for standing up and not simply bowing down with all the other Republicans as a result of the violence on the Capitol on January 6th. That Hawley said he was going to, question these votes, question these electoral results, and he did. And and as you can see, I mean, Republicans still very much think whether or not they believe there was, voting machines that changed votes or something like that, which is a different question. But Republicans are very much of the thought that, the way in which governors and state courts changed election procedures over the will of state legislatures is of questionable legitimacy, to say the least.
I don't know, of course, because no one knows, but I would be just surprised. I'd be very surprised if it turns out that there was not widespread voter fraud by Democrats in the 2020 election. How about you?
Well, fraud is a broad category, and I don't think that any election anywhere is, perfect and immaculate.
Right.
So, I don't know. I don't think there was a lot. I don't think there were changes by voting machines or anything like that. I actually have a long background with this because back in 2008, I joined the Ron Paul presidential campaign, primary campaign, right after New Hampshire. And at that point, every Ron Paul supporter was convinced that the voting machines in New Hampshire must have been rigged because Ron Paul only finished third or fourth or whatever. And, so I know what it's like to be at the center of, angry voters calling you up and saying, why aren't you guys protesting this? And of course, the answer is because the campaign's got to move on to the next contest. It can't simply refight a battle it already lost. No, I think, first of all, I think the 2020 election was an anti-incumbent election generally. So the Democrats controlled the House. They lost seats in the House. Republicans controlled the Senate. They wound up losing seats and ultimately losing control of the Senate. Republicans controlled the White House. They lost that. And it's, people really are affected psychologically by economic conditions, by something like COVID. They really do feel like you've got to change government. I mean, it's a mystical, superstitious belief that you can change this ritual and therefore you're going to, produce new results. But that's, I think, sort of a deep psychological motive of a lot of people, especially the middle class white voters who abandoned Trump. I mean, there's an ideological component to it, but I think a lot of it was just a feeling that, the country was unstable and that therefore you needed to switch, as the country was unstable as a result of COVID, and therefore you needed to switch political control. But no, I'm actually kind of skeptical as to, how widespread, actual fraud was. I think there's always some, but I don't think that's what tipped the election against Trump.
Really? Let me read something that you wrote in September about mail-in voting. You said, this promises to be the trigger of an even worse voting process breakdown than the one that occurred in 2000. I'm not done yet, Daniel.
And it was.
Hold on. It increases the risk of lost ballots, dubiously, quote, found ballots, and spoiled or improperly completed ballots whose validity will be subject to interpretation. This was your prediction in September. This is before it actually happened. You know about this poll, this survey. I haven't looked into it, but I've heard from multiple sources that some survey was taken of all the electoral processes, and the 26 most advanced nations, and the United States finished 26th.
I've heard about that. Yeah. And I will say, I mean, one of the things that and it had already happened by the time I wrote that article, and I probably should have accounted for it. But of course, if you get rid of things like signature verification, if you change a lot of these sort of technical rules for how you determine these undecided ballots, then, you're not going to, I mean, what was it that, was it Stalin who said, if there's no problem, I forget how he framed it, but basically, if you just destroy the thing that was going to be a problem, then it's not going to be a problem anymore. So in this case, and I think it is true that if you look at the rejection rates plummeted. Was that a result of fraud? Well, it was a result of changing the rules. So do you call it fraud if it's valid under the new rules? I don't know if you can call it cheating in the old sense, but it certainly is. I think the rule change is the thing that's most objectionable there. And my column, which you've quoted from, I mean, the primary thing I'm talking about there is the kind of psychological pressure that I think is brought to bear when elections are not done in private in a voting booth, but are instead drawn out over months by a mail-in process. Because then I think people become pressured by whoever's in the room with them. They become pressured by a relentless drumbeat from the media. I think that's a very sort of big distortion on election results. Whereas I think if it's done in the privacy of your own voting booth, you can say things that are against the crowd and say things that are against the epistemic elite in the media by voting for the wrong candidate. Right?
Yeah, let's talk about the Democrats, which is really I want to get at the character of the current Democratic Party. I've been really, every day I've been wondering if this is me having changed or if it's them having changed. I mean, I used to be a Democrat. I used to be sort of a left-wing critic within the Democratic Party. That's ages ago. I'm far from that. Now I see it. I just don't recall. So in other words, I've been following the Democratic Party pretty closely since the 1980s. All right. So I feel like I know that entity pretty well. I simply do not recall any political organization, either political party, ever being this corrupt and ruthless as the current Democratic Party. Is that your feeling about this current crop? I'm not saying anything particularly kind about previous Democrats. They had plenty of corruption and scandals and ruthlessness. But I mean, since Vietnam, I would say, I've never seen either political party behave in such Machiavellian ways. Is that fair?
Yeah, they want to rule or ruin at this point, and of course they have adopted, the most hateful possible rhetoric towards people who disagree with them. So if you are not on board with them, you are a racist, you are a Nazi,
domestic terrorist,
fascist, a domestic terrorist, right? And of course, they are working together with the national security state to try to, they're going to make examples out of the people who are easily made examples of. But then I think that's probably not going to be the end of it. Just as the immediate reaction 9/11 has carried over to this day. By the way, I'll tell you something interesting. I flew back from Orlando, Florida, a couple of weeks ago, and there at the gate of the, as we were about to board the flight, there was a new extra layer of security. This is a flight going from Orlando to Washington, D.C.
Oh.
Suddenly, there were TSA agents right there at the gate, asking everyone to present ID before they got on the plane for a second time, and also doing spot checks on bags. They would just take anyone's bag and rummage through it. So this was a bit of security theater to tell us. And I kind of suspect that the fact it was coming from Orlando, Florida, sort of Trump land, was all the more reason for it, right? So they're basically sending a signal, hey, you Trump voters, you know where you belong in jail, and maybe we'll let you get on this flight, but be warned, we're coming for you.
Well, there's only 70 million of them. That shouldn't be a problem. No big
well, that's
deal.
The other thing too. The Democrats and the liberals talk about, that the Republicans are anti-democratic. And they think that if they get a plebiscitary system where if you win an election by 1 vote or 5 votes, or for that matter, 1,000,000 votes, that you can then do whatever the hell you want to the people who lost the election. And that is contrary to every, sort of basic understanding of not just the rule of law, but also of just civil peace, right? And that seems to be that I think is the most ruthless and corrupt thing about the Democrats right now.
Wait, isn't that the rule of democracy, that the majority gets to do whatever it wants to the minority?
It's the rule of a pure democracy, but of course, we have a lot of impurities in our democracy. But liberals and Democrats are complaining about that right now. They're saying, look, the Senate is not proportioned according to population. It's not supposed to be, of course. There's a good reason it's not proportioned according to population. Or, the Electoral College, the fact you can have a president who doesn't have a popular majority. All these things are being criticized, and all these things. And again, and the kind of majorities that the Democrats want to create, which I think is of the utmost significance, are these plebiscitary, majorities out of a, sort of voting base of hundreds of millions of people. They reject the idea that you could have democracy at the local level, because of course that leads you to federalism questions and all sorts of problems. Well, but your vote among 500 or even 50,000 people at the local level counts for more, and your activism counts for more than it does among a pool of 320 million people, right? So I think it's actually anti-democratic to have that kind of plebiscitary democracy at the scale of 300 million people. And of course, there's no reason why you should stop there. If you want to keep going, why not have a global, quote unquote, democracy of 6 billion people or whatever, where because, there's no ability to organize any kind of, minority or dissentient interest among that big a population, it winds up all being guided and manipulated by, again, the epistemic elite.
Yeah. You're talking about Davos now. You're getting into Davos territory. That is the plan, right? It is a global proposition here to remake the world in the image of the American democratic, watered down, corrupt system, right?
Yeah, it's taking the worst elements of our system, and the worst elements of a lot of foreign systems as well. So,
and managed by Klaus Schwab in his villa, in his village, in his villa in Switzerland or whatever it is.
But
right?
the thing that really bugs me, and again, you criticize democracy, and there are wonderfully valid philosophical critiques of democracy going back to Plato and Aristotle. But what really burns me up is that the epistemic elite will just yammer on and on and on about democracy. They don't care about democracy; they only care about their own power. And they will manipulate democracy and adjust its parameters however much they need to in order to get the results they want. Always, always, always. They are not believers in the will of the people being untutored by the correct kind of teacher. And in fact, they despise the idea that, ordinary folks would have views of their own and act upon them and get them politically represented.
Yeah, this is why, we should all be assuming that the Democrats cheated in the election. No, I mean this because look at, were they not morally obligated by their own beliefs and rhetoric about Trump to cheat? So he was Hitler, except even worse. And he was the president of the United States who was threatening to become the president again for another 4 years to wreak Nazi havoc on not just us, but the whole world. Now, if I, Thad, believed that this was the case, that Hitler was in the White House and might be in the White House for another 4 years, I would sign up, Daniel, right here. I'm telling the world, I would sign up to cheat, to stuff out ballot boxes, to do whatever it took by any means necessary, as Malcolm X said, to keep that guy out of office, to get him out of office. Am I wrong? Did they not say?
No, I think the moral logic there is impeccable. Yeah. And the only reason why I don't think it was something they had to do is because they were pretty confident of the outcome of the election, and in fact they were astonished that it turned out that all of the propaganda that they had unleashed over the past 4 years failed to suppress the Trump vote even more than it did. And the fact that you still had 75 million Americans come out for Trump, that's still something which, despite having won the White House, despite now having both houses of Congress, there is a part of the Democratic Party, the intelligent part of the sort of liberals and progressives, which is really scared to death after the 2020 election and does not view it as a victory and is really terrified of what's coming. And again, I highly recommend this analysis by David Shore, which appears in a New York Magazine interview with him, where Shore, sort of talks about how alienated this epistemic elite, that's not his term, but he talks about the educated, liberals, white liberals in this country, just how alienated they are from the rest of the population. And he says that, this is Donald Trump. The headline of the story is Donald Trump was good for the Republican Party.
Yeah. When you say epistemic elite, I just want to make sure everyone understands. Define that. What do you mean by it? I love it. But what does that mean?
Well, they're the college-educated class.
Yeah.
And what makes them notable is not just that they have a college education, but that they all have a certain center of gravity ideologically. They believe in basically two things. The first is a kind of scientific technocracy.
Yeah.
So they believe that you can take the methods of the physical sciences, apply them to the so-called social sciences, and have, manipulate people the way you would manipulate, atoms in a super collider or something like that.
Right.
Or that you can engineer society the way you can engineer a building.
Right.
So that's one belief. They really, really believe that these, statistical tables that might, get larded into a APSA article or something are really telling you the truth about, human beings. And they would never question the idea that, look, if people have subjective views even about factual things like a murder they are eyewitnesses to, how can they possibly have, objective views about their own subjective beliefs, right? The things that all social science is built on these, opinion surveys. It's like the opinion surveys are just total subjectivity. So why would you assume that, aggregating that suddenly starts to give you factual truth? Anyway, but that's a hobby horse of my own. But yeah, they have that technocratic element, and then they have a progressive, sort of moral outlook on the world as well.
I was going to say, the other thing is they believe that truth can only be found, and this is not an overstatement, can only be found at Harvard.
It's true. They believe that, the methods and the credentialing for the expertise to perform the correct methods. It is indeed a clerisy. You have to have the correct chain of apostolic succession. You have to be consecrated by a legitimate bishop in order to have a correct understanding of philosophy and of political science and of economics. And if you don't have those credentials, then your views are obviously wrong. They don't even need to be considered because they're not even within the realm of things that have to be debated. Only with debates within the clerisy over theology are of importance to reality in the world.
Beautifully put. I love that. Daniel, we've been talking for almost an hour and a half. I don't know how that happened. This has flown by. It's been fantastic. Here's the bad news. I have a list I'm looking at of about a dozen questions I had for you. And guess how many we've covered?
One? Two. Well, that's good. That's twice as many as I thought.
So let's see. Let's talk about Rush Limbaugh. I know you wrote a piece about Rush right after he died recently. I struggle to find much of value in Rush Limbaugh. I am very sympathetic to a lot of conservatives, as you know, personally, but it's the cheerleading for the wars that really I can't get warm feelings for someone like that. But what you tell me, like you tell us, what's your take on Rush and what you feel? It's obvious what his importance was. We all know that. You can speak to that too, but just sort of like, were you a Rush fan?
I wasn't really a Rush fan. However, one thing that I think listeners and viewers today have to think about is that when Rush Limbaugh came on the scene in the late 80s and, kind of reached the zenith of his importance for politics around the 1994 midterm election, which he was seen as having played a role in kind of helping the Republicans get over the top there and win the first majority in 40 years. When Rush Limbaugh was at his zenith in those years, he was virtually alone. There was nothing like him in the media. There was no Fox News, and there was no internet. Mm-hmm. So if you didn't like what you were hearing from CNN, and you didn't like what you were hearing from, CBS, NBC, ABC, PBS, NPR, and all the rest, you could subscribe to National Review, and once every 2 weeks, you would get a little dose of conservatism. But if you actually wanted to have some sort of daily alternative to all the other media out there, Rush Limbaugh was the only thing, or practically the only thing. There were other dissentient hosts, but they generally didn't have the kind of national sweep that Rush Limbaugh did. So in that sense, I think Rush Limbaugh was, he was in a way, he was his own social network too. He was somebody who, before the internet, was going out there and was, talking to a lot of conservatives who'd never heard someone else reflect their own views or, where they were coming from in a broad way. And so that was very, powerful in creating a new sense of conservative community and so forth. And I thought, you do need an alternative. You do need someone like Rush Limbaugh in those conditions. Of course, by the Bush years, George W. Bush, you had Fox News, you had a whole panoply of established conservative outlets. And Rush Limbaugh, like Sean Hannity, was just going along and, amplifying the Bush, sort of militaristic message and everything else. So I wasn't listening to Rush Limbaugh at that point, and I had, sort of no use for him. I was very critical of, what he was saying at that point. And I would have written Rush off, as having played a significant role in the late 80s, early 90s, but having become a very destructive force in the 2000s. But, in the past couple of years, during the Trump era, Rush Limbaugh, again, because he has been willing to say things that, Fox News has Tucker Carlson, has a few hosts who are, sort of Tribune-like representatives of Trumpian sentiment. But even a lot of conservative media in the Trump years was not really, reflecting a populist Trump spirit. And Limbaugh, to his credit, I think, kind of turned away from the Bush stuff and started to turn more towards some of the populist ideas. So it's not that, Rush Limbaugh was ever an ideas man, but, but I think it was more than just that he was always opportunistically following the tide. And there's another element of opportunism there. But I think there's also just a sense that he wanted to disciple himself or wanted to be taught by whatever conservative authority was present at the time. And at one point that was Bill Buckley. At another point that was going to be George W. Bush. Then finally it was Donald Trump and the Trump phenomenon. And there's a certain kind of innocence in that, which I think had some value. It's not what you want to see, from everyone, but I think I give Rush Limbaugh credit for, in some ways, whether you call it opportunism or whether it's simply not being a principled neocon. That's great. Whatever it took to make him less Bush and more Trump, that I approve of.
I watched his 60 Minutes interview from way back in the early 90s, I think it was, in which he pretty much admits that he was primarily motivated by money. So is it possible that Rush Limbaugh was first and foremost just a businessman?
Yeah, he used to say, not only in that interview, but in others, that he was an entertainer at heart.
Yeah.
And I think that comes through in his program.
Yeah.
But I think it is important that entertainment and politics are not these entirely separate fields. In fact, for some of the reasons we've discussed about people being fundamentally emotional and that there's a certain element of anarchy there, the relationship between showbiz and politics is therefore very powerful. Limbaugh represented that, but so of course did Ronald Reagan, and so did Donald Trump. And I think that that's not a bad thing. I mean, we're often shamed. We're told, well, you should really support some, absolutely pencil-necked technocrat who, has this ideological principle. I mean, we've seen what ideological principle did under Marxism, right? Where we've seen a lot of, very smart intellectual radicals create absolute hell for their countries. I don't want that. I'd rather have a total emotional, baby of some sort up there on stage than have that kind of epistemic lunatic.
Yeah.
So,
well, yeah, the ideologue is the hardest one to place any leverage on. I mean, he's the hardest one to change, right? The ideologue,
they're usually the most dangerous people. Yeah, although I guess someone like Hitler clearly was an emotional manipulator far more than he was an intellectual. So I mean, you can, when you get to that level, have extreme destructiveness.
No, but
usually the ideologues are the most dangerous people.
Yeah, the ones who are really true believers, right? Because they cannot be changed. They're gonna pursue that line until they die, right?
Yeah, and again with Rush Limbaugh, one of the curious things is that he sometimes had pretty good taste in music, and there's this weird. I'm not a big Elton John fan, but there's this weird attraction that you see on the populist right towards Elton John for some reason. I know because he performed at Rush Limbaugh's wedding, which was a controversy that liberals, hated.
Right.
And Elton John, to his credit, said, I hope he takes the message from my music, and that you shouldn't be attacking me for performing at his wedding. And then of course, you've got Donald Trump also. There's this wonderful, almost filmic video where Donald Trump is on the tarmac as he's leaving a rally or maybe arriving for a rally. I think he's leaving. tiny dancers playing over the PA, and you have someone come up to him and say that Ruth Bader Ginsburg has just died, and Trump just says, "Oh, that's terrible." I mean, she was an impressive American, and he sounds sincere. And you've got this sentimental soundtrack playing. It just seems like a scene right out of a film. I think it's kind of wonderful and magical. I think it's Americans should celebrate that. And of course, he's saying nice things which seem to be kind of sincere about Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Mm-hmm. And instead progressives hate him and loathe him and whatnot. But there's something to be said for the fact that he's not as much of an ideologue, and he's a more sentimental person than his detractors would say.
I agree. Okay, I got a couple things more for you. I just want to get on contemporary politics, and want to see what your take is on this. Some of this involves predictions, which I know is always dicey, but well.
And I'm sorry for my finger going across the screen a minute ago. I had to check my battery.
I saw.
I've got 20%, so I think we're okay.
Yeah, we're fine. We're wrapping up here anyway. So, okay. The Republican Party, now they, I guess the debate is over because Trump firmly declared that he's not going to go for a third party, but there has been a bit of a debate going on within the Republican Party as to whether or not to establish a third party, whether the Trumpists should leave and, form an opposition party to the Republicans. Now, Trump has said, no, we're not going to do that because it'll just split the vote and destroy the conservative movement overall. What's your prediction on that? I mean, whether or not you think it's a good thing? I think it's always a good thing. I want more parties no matter what. I don't care. I want Italy. I want like 100 different political parties. I want more choice, more competition. It just makes a more interesting conversation, holds politicians more accountable, I believe. But do you think the Republicans are going to split in any time in the near future?
No, I don't. And what I think is interesting is, why don't people like Liz Cheney split off and form their own party?
Yeah.
Because they're obviously not just mad about Donald Trump. They're mad about the 75 million people who voted for Donald Trump. They're mad about all their colleagues who refused to impeach him, which is the number of Republicans who supported impeachment was just pathetic. Yeah. And clearly those 5 or 6 Republicans don't belong in the party. Yeah. And if they really, for whatever reason, don't want to be part of the Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer and Joe Biden Democratic Party, which it seems to me they would actually fit in perfectly with. Totally. But if they really can't cross that river, why don't they form their own party? And if they think that neoconservatism really is such a valuable contribution to American life and has so much support among the American people, shouldn't it be able to sustain its own party? Why do they have to be in the Republican Party, wielding influence within the sort of councils of the party, the insider elements? If they think that they what it is it's clearly signaling the oligarchic ambitions of people like Liz Cheney. They know that the Republican Party hates them. They hate the Republican Party, yet they are in the leadership and they want to maintain their position in the leadership because they know it does not matter what the party voters actually like or care about.
It's funny as you're saying that. I mean, like the neocon intellectuals, Kristol and Kagan and company, did make the switch. They did go over to the Democrats, right? And so, right?
Well, that's right. Yeah. I mean, a lot of them started, their fathers were Democrats and now they've switched back.
They've come home.
Bill Kristol, I think, still tries to triangulate a little bit. I mean, he says he's functionally a Democrat, but he doesn't want to be, all in. But I mean, really, these were people who were huge fans of people like Joe Lieberman, for example. Yep. They used to love the idea of a McCain-Lieberman ticket or a Lieberman-McCain ticket. Yep. I mean, why the hell don't they belong to the party of Joe Biden? Maybe Joe Biden's too conservative for them. Maybe he's too much of a nationalist or something. I don't know.
Could be. No, I think you're absolutely right. They should join the Democratic Party. But yeah, this old rump establishment of the Republican Party, the Liz Cheneys, the Mitch McConnells, the Lindsey Grahams, they seem to have zero base even within their own party. Am I right about that? Are they just dead?
They're pretty much dead, although it'll be, it's interesting to see that some of them do survive in individual congressional districts. It'll be interesting to see what happens with Liz Cheney in Wyoming. I don't want to make a prediction. I was surprised that Liz Cheney was maintained in her leadership position when there was a vote to throw her out. And the Wyoming Republican Party, I believe, did censure her. So there's clearly some opposition to her. But it's remarkable. I mean, the neocons were always very, very good institutional warfighters. They would get into an institution, they would get into positions of power, they would crush their opponents ruthlessly, and it was always very hard to dislodge them. They are much better at playing those games than sort of naive and sentimental people like Donald Trump or his voters might be.
Right. Last question. Big tech. What the hell are we going to do? Do you favor legislation to break up the big tech corporations, antitrust legislation, or do you want them to just
I don't know if the
face the
legislation would actually
competition?
do the job, right?
Yeah,
So
right.
if you break up Twitter and Facebook and Google, and you have multiple Twitters, Facebooks, and Googles, does that really change anything? So if you look at the deplatforming of Parler, for example, so Parler, they tried to do the right thing. The libertarians will all say, "Hey, if you don't like what Twitter's doing, start your own social network." Okay, Parler started their own social network. What happened to them? Apple said, "Well, you know what? We're not going to let you be on our store anymore." And then Amazon said, "We're not going to let you use our servers anymore." So it turns out not only do you have to start your own social network, you've got to start your own, app store, and you've got to start your own server farms. And ultimately, of course, it's going to be, well, hey, we're not going to process your payments. We're not going to let you take Visa and MasterCard.
Right.
You've got to start your own financial system as well. Now, maybe that's going to happen. You've got things like blockchain. You've got ways to circumvent the daylight economy.
Yes.
I think progressives are going to be very, very unhappy what happens if those kinds of alternatives ultimately do grow up, because that's going to unwind a lot of establishment institutions, and they're going to have no control whatsoever over what happens at these places, and it's going to be wild.
Yeah.
And the things that they're worried about are going to be far worse in these other channels in the dark web than they are, when they're on the Apple Store or when they're hosted by Amazon. So they need to be careful what they wish for. I don't know what's going to happen, though. I mean, it sucks. There's clearly, Ryan Anderson, I don't know if you should have him on your show, actually. He's the guy who wrote this book, When Harry Became Sally.
Oh, yeah.
He's a conservative, Catholic, philosophically educated guy. He criticizes the transgender movement. And his book has been yanked from Amazon. Okay. And, just completely withdrawn. And they say this is in violation of our terms of service because it says, bad things about transgender people. And actually, this is not, he's not even a Steve Bannon type. Ryan Anderson is a very, sort of loving Christian, he's someone who does not have animus towards transgendered people or homosexuals. He's someone who, but does on principle think that they are harming themselves and that they've adopted a bad way of life. Well, his book is impermissible as far as the commissars at Amazon are concerned. And, if someone like him can be squashed like that, I think there's going to be a lot more of this in the future. Right now, of course, Dr. Seuss is, being a little bit purged. He had some very politically incorrect, sort of ethnic caricatures in his early works. So the copyright holders are now saying, well, we're not going to allow these books to be published anymore. That's a minor thing in itself, but I think it is symptomatic of what's happening, And what worries me is that it's not just, sort of Amazon, it's not just Twitter, it's not just Facebook. It's like a moral cartel, you know? So, cartelization as an economic problem is something people understand.
Brilliant.
But cartelization as a cultural problem is something I think that, economists don't take that seriously because they don't take culture seriously.
That's right.
But it can wield power in a very domineering and very just, unpleasant and unfun way. And that, I think, is what we're in the midst of.
We've had a liberal moral cartel for about 70, I would say, since World War II.
It's gotten a lot worse. There used to be, you had various competing elements. I think in the last, it's surprising how sometime in the middle of the Obama years, it seemed to really pick up censorious momentum. I heard a talk recently by Greg Lukianov from the Freedom and Individual Rights in Education Institute. And he said that it used to be that when they would go to college campuses, when there was some free speech problem, the administrators and the faculty would all be against free speech. But the students, even the left-wing students, the liberal students, were all reflexively pro-free speech.
Right.
And he said that sometime around 2011 or 2013, that changed. And now, in fact, he goes to campuses and he finds the students themselves hate the idea of free speech.
Yep.
He thinks that perhaps it had something to do with anti-bullying campaigns, which I've always, had this, I've never looked at things closely enough to say precisely, but I've always suspected that anti-bullying ideology is really just a form of bullying people. And so I've always been suspicious of that. And I think it's true that now, if you look at the way in which victimhood is wielded as a weapon, it's obviously very effective. You can't debate it. You can't, gainsay it. And people are ruthless about seeking power. So they're using it.
Yeah. Well, that depressed me, Daniel, but I was so excited with what you said before then about the flowering of multiple alternative social media networks out there and how progressives will not be able to control them and how much it'll be so much worse for them in the future. That got me almost sexually excited, I got to say. So thank you for that. And thank you for this. This has been wonderful. It's exactly what I wanted. I wanted just a hardcore dose of good political analysis, and I got it from you, and I got it from a very interesting point of view. Unique. You're just aren't many of you out there, although I guess you've maybe found some compatriots in the Trump movement to some extent. But
Yeah, I'm surprised actually by the number of young people I run into, staffers on Capitol Hill, people who are working for the administration who have views that are very similar to mine. And, it's clear that they've read some of the things I've read. They've read me as well. And it makes me hopeful. It makes me think that actually these ideas are gaining traction. And also I think that, the best of Generation Z are probably, rejecting the pap they're fed by liberalism and the hypocrisy of it. And that's getting them interested in tuning into your broadcast, for example.
Yeah.
And I think it's getting them interested in Donald Trump as well. So it's all the anarchists against, the liberal tyranny.
That's right. Against the state. We're enemies of the state. That's it. Thank you, Daniel, for coming back on. This has been a real pleasure, as I said.
Thank you.
And we'll, and we're going to talk. You're going to teach a course for us on conservatism.
That's the plan. Yeah.
This is the man for Renegade University. I've been wanting to do this for a while. We just discussed it. It'll be coming out probably in the next few months. Look for that. This is the guy to teach that course. I will definitely be a student. It's going to be very exciting. So thanks for everything. And we'll be talking soon.
Thank you again.
Bye, Daniel. This is the Unregistered podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. To join the new Renegade University, go to renegadeuniversity.com. To join the new Unregistered Underground, the supporting listeners group for the podcast, go to unregisteredunderground.com. Thanks for listening.